For Polity in Johannesburg, I'm Darlene Creamer. Author Peter Auf Der Heyde joins me to discuss his profoundly moving and heartbreaking book, Death in Pretoria, Untold Stories of Political Activists Executed During Apartheid. This powerful book uncovers a long buried chapter of South Africa's history. Between 1960 and 1989, more than 130 people were executed for politically motivated crimes. These people who gave their lives to the struggle for justice were executed under a system which was inherently unjust. Peter, please can you tell us how you came to write this book, a project that took you on a long, often overwhelming and deeply emotional journey?
I've always been very interested in the death penalty and in executions. I'm unashamedly anti-death penalty. And I was chatting to a friend of mine from Grahamstown, from Rhodes University, then still called Grahamstown, and he was doing an exhibition for the Apartheid Museum in Gold Reef City. And when he noticed that I was so interested in death penalty, he asked me to compile a list of people who were executed in South Africa for crimes of a political nature.
In the course of your research, you discovered that most of those people sentenced to death had been defended by pro Deo advocates. While pro Deo means for God in Latin, the legal defense described in many court transcripts was far from godly. What did you uncover about the quality of legal representation these prisoners received? Please also reflect on the troubling case involving advocate S.H.E. Wynand, who was assigned to defend 3 accused individuals, but made no effort to do so.
Yes, if I can maybe go back one small step, after compiling the list, and to compile the list, I had to speak to people because I received a list from the government which included over 3,000 names, and then I had to go through it and see where there was a political connection. And during this research, I started talking to people. And a lot of the people that I spoke to had relatives who had been executed, and I also spoke to judges and attorneys. And I found out that in virtually, I would say, probably 90% of the cases, they had been represented by pro Deo, as you quite correctly say. And these pro Deo advocates or counsel who defended, they were very young, they were very inexperienced because the state's pay was much lower than you could receive if you were private. So it was the young, inexperienced defenders that they got, the young, inexperienced advocates. And to make matters worse, they were also completely overwhelmed in that sometimes they had up to 20 clients that they had to defend against the death penalty, so to say. And they were charged with murder, 20 people, and then they had to defend all these 20 people, which made it really difficult. And then in some alarming cases, and the one that you refer to, Advocate Wynand, that was a very bad case in that the state decided whether to go ahead with an execution by virtue of what they called a mercy report. So the President's Council, which was the state president, the Minister of Justice, and a few other ministers, would meet and they would decide, and they would do so on reports by their own law advisors and by the advocates for the defense. And in this case, I saw that Advocate Wynand said that in this case, his clients were lying and the state's attorneys were much more credible. So he kind of, in a way, sold his own clients down the river.
One of the chapters in your book, titled The Length of the Rope, goes into harrowing detail how executions were carried out. Please share some of the information you uncovered for that chapter.
Yes, I managed to speak to one of the people who had been involved in the actual execution of people, not the kind of the pressing the buttons or something, but he had been involved in the preparation for the event. He was employed by the Deputy Sheriff of Pretoria. His name was Pat Malvino, and I sat down with him. And the first thing he did was he looked at me and he said, you're whatever 200 pounds or whatever pounds I was, you're 6 foot something, and your neck circumference is XYZ. And he did that to work out how long the rope would have to be to hang a person. And I found out things that he shared with me, for instance, that after they set a date for the prisoners then had 7 days before the actual execution took place. He also shared that visitors were allowed, so the state tried to bring visitors to the execution, so you had an opportunity to say goodbye to your children, to your wife, whatever it was. The interview with him was a good juxtaposition with an interview that I did with a former death row prisoners who told me what it was like for them. And then, to speak to Mr. Malvino was what it was like for the functionaries. And it was not always the same, the stories that they told. Oh, and I never did find out how long the rope would have to be to hang me. He didn't tell me that.
Tell us about your meeting with Ramon Leon, one of the few South Africans who had experienced the death penalty from both perspectives. First as a lawyer whose clients were sentenced to death, and later as a judge who imposed the death penalty.
Yes, in a nutshell, it was a really interesting interview. Mr. Justice Leon, as an advocate, defended the Cato Manor case, where quite a lot of people were sentenced to death for the death of a number of policemen during some beer raids in Cato Manor. And he then became a judge. And the case that he's known for, and for one that he's very bitter, is the Andrew Zondo case, the young ANC cadre who placed the bomb in Amanzimtoti. Now, not everybody might know, but if a person was convicted of murder without extenuating circumstances, the judge had to sentence the person to death. That was the legal requirement. And Justice Leon said that he was bitter because he said he had to find him guilty without extenuating circumstances. Thus, he had no choice but to sentence him to death. Critics have said, and I think there's some validity to that argument, that Andrew Zondo, at the time, he wasn't even 21 years old. I think he was 19 at the time, and that youth should have counted as an extenuating circumstance, thus allowing Leon not to sentence him to death. But as I said, it was really interesting to hear both perspectives, and the bitterness came through a lot.
While reviewing the files of the executed, you came across many letters, some written by prisoners and never sent, others addressed to them but never delivered. Could you share what struck you, not only by the contents, but also by the remarks left by the prison wardens?
As you say, I had access to prisoner files in what was then still called Pretoria Central. In hindsight, to be quite honest, I don't know why I got that access, because it's not an access that's normally granted. I must have just, in a way, fallen through the cracks, and they just didn't know what, and they just allowed me access to it. And I came across really astonishing things, personal letters that had been sent, that the prisoners hadn't received, letters they had written, which hadn't been passed on, and also, as you say, the comments. So what struck me at first was just the normality of it all, in that they were kind of continuing with their lives in a way, and were telling their relatives in the Transkei, or, what to do with the cows, etc. So they were trying to live their lives whilst on death row. But there were also those who maintained a kind of a political stance. I saw a few letters, for instance, the state used to give people, I think at that stage it was 5 rand to buy a chicken just the day before they were executed. And some of the prisoners turned that down and said, we haven't received anything from the state before, so we don't want your 5 rand. Others turned down the request for a priest also. So that was also something that was. And then, yes, obviously all the letters were censored. And in some cases, it must have been very difficult for the censor, because often the letters were in Sesotho or Xhosa or Zulu or something like that. And obviously, white warders were generally not able to read them. So somebody would then have to write to another warder and saying, look, you can't send that off for this and this reason. Yeah, and so that was also very interesting.
Your research took you to former Pretoria Central Prison, as you mentioned, now called Nkosi Mpuru Correction Facility, where the gallows have been reconstructed as part of a gallows memorial museum. There you discovered missing names, spelling errors, and a broader sense that the memorial itself was flawed. Can you explain why you left feeling that the memorial represented everything that was wrong with South Africa during those times?
Yes, I was quite, I think shocked When I went to this museum, they were super friendly in giving me access, very knowledgeable, the people who took me through. But once you get to the actual chambers where people were executed, you went through a room. There was one room where there were stories about those who were executed, and then you came to the chambers. And in the chambers, there were the plaque for all the people who had been executed for political reasons. And even between the two rooms, there was different spellings already for names. And I just felt that, you know, the only thing that a person really has is his or her name, you know, and to not get that right, I think is the final insult. There was also one, I would say, very terrible case in that I came across two names that I didn't have on my list and I'd never seen before. And I then went off and read their record, and nowhere in the record and nowhere anywhere has any political organization claimed these two people either. They were, sadly to say, they were basically two people who just committed a horrific murder and rape, and how they slipped through the cracks, I just have no idea. And I think it was just an indication that the stories of those executed for political crimes were just simply not important enough. They weren't important enough for the old government, and it seems even, and sadly, the new government has not spent enough resources doing a thorough and proper job.
Another heartbreaking story in your book is that of no large Nomali Mbuya Vakuchio, who was just 3 years old when her father Goli Sonamzi was executed. Can you elaborate on how her story highlighted the stark disparity in support between the families of Robben Island prisoners and other families, especially those linked to the Pan-Africanist Congress activists who received little or no assistance?
Yes, throughout the book, I did so many interviews and I heard so many heartbreaking stories. And the large Vakuchiwa was one of them. She was, as you say, very young when her father was executed, but nobody told her that her father had been executed. And she thought that he was off in Cape Town working, as so many men did in those times. And when she found out, that was obviously very, very traumatic for her. She struggled throughout her life financially very badly. To make matters worse, all people who were executed were entitled to the special pension that the government awarded to people who had sacrificed and suffered under apartheid, who had been imprisoned for political reasons. They received a special pension. The problem is that so many of those families of those who had been executed struggled to get their special pension or didn't get it at all for a number of various reasons. One of the reasons was that the state wanted them to provide death certificates. You know, and if you're sitting somewhere in rural Transkei, to then be told by some bureaucrat in Pretoria, well, you have to bring a death certificate. They wouldn't even know how to start getting a death certificate. You know, and I'm just thinking, well, the state executed them. They know they executed them, but they have to still prove that they're dead. That was quite bad. And to come back to your question, why maybe so much has been done for ex-prisoners, say the Robben Island prisoners or others, I think partly in a way because the Robben Island prisoners were alive, and in a way they could be used at those times to push a political agenda. Quite correctly, I'm not arguing that that's not the case. But those who were executed were no longer alive. They weren't high profile. So simply, sadly, nobody cared. But I think the special pension was something that was very bad. And the recognition, so in Nolage's case, for instance, the recognition might not have put food on her plate, but at the end of the day, it might have given her some dignity and restored some of the dignity.
Please tell us about Vuyisile Mini, the freedom fighter and composer who sang one of his own songs as he walked the 52 steps to his execution, and also about John Harris, the only white person to be executed for a political act against apartheid.
Yes, the interview with Makosazana Mini is one that stands out, though I do say that all of them in a way stand out because of the stories they told. But I asked her to describe her father to me, and her answer was a big red hula hoop. And that I kind of said, what? And then she explained it that her father had made her this hula hoop. So again, I think that shows how people didn't necessarily see their parents, their brothers, their sisters as a political being so much as a person, somebody who, in this case, makes a red hula hoop, and her hula hoop was stolen, and then her father got it back for her. So that stood out. Very sadly, then also her sister, Nomkosi, went into exile and was in fact killed by the SADF in a raid on Maseru. And Makosasana was actually due to go to her the very next day, and had planned to be there already on the day of the raid. But Nomkosi wanted, I think, a dress or some shoes, I'm not sure which of the two, to bring her, but she couldn't get them, so she wanted to leave the day after. So this family, if you think about it, she's lost her father to an execution, in a way her sister to another execution, though not judicial execution. So that was very emotional, that interview. And then John Harris, as you say, the only white person executed for political crimes. His story is quite tragic. Well, all the stories are obviously tragic, but he actually phoned the police and newspapers and gave a warning that he had placed a bomb. And it is alleged that the state decided not to act on the warnings. Obviously, I don't know if that's true, but I spoke to his wife and to his son and to the wife's sister, who became a nun. And just the calmness, the forgiveness of all three of the people concerned, and the humbleness. They said they don't really want a book about John Harris because they don't want him to stand out. There's no difference between him and Vuyisile Mini and Solomon Mahlangu. There's no difference, and they didn't want him to stand out. And I kind of, in a way, I then had an argument with them, because I said it's important that we hear these stories. We need to hear these stories, that there are these people who are willing to sacrifice their lives to make the lives of others better. And if we don't hear these stories, we can't, in a way, try to emulate them. We can't follow in their footsteps. So that was a very emotional interview.
Could you please speak to us to the issue of innocence, which is perhaps the most powerful argument against the death penalty? In your book, there appears to be a compelling case that two of the individuals may in fact have been innocent.
Yes, as you quite correctly say, when people argue for the death penalty, my question always would be to them, how many innocent people are you willing to be killed in pursuit of the death penalty? And in my research, I came across a document which said streng geheim, and it was a note from the Minister of Justice to his own law reporters, and he said that he does not agree with the report that they wrote, and they had to rewrite their report accordingly to what he wanted them to write and resubmit it to this presidential council, to the Mercy report, which then based its, and what the law reporters had said, because they would either recommend clemency or say go ahead with the execution. And in this case, the two prisoners, Aaron Jokwana and Joseph Risani, should not be granted clemency. They should be released because they're not guilty. And as I said, the Minister of Justice crossed that out, said, I don't agree, resubmit your report. And one wonders, and I'm pretty sure that the people who then took the decision whether to execute them or not never knew that there had been a first report. They only based their recommendation whether to go ahead with the execution based on the second report, which obviously then said, execute them, they're guilty. I personally think this is a case that I think the state, in a way, has a duty to the relatives of the two, but even if no relatives can be found, but even to the memory of those two, to look into that case and go through the records and even possibly grant a posthumous declaration of innocence.
Your book reveals so many injustices. What moment stood out most for you, and do you believe there is any real hope for justice or recognition for the families who were so deeply affected?
I think what stood out was the humbleness and the way in which people were so willing to share their stories. I remember one case in Bashi Bridge where an entire 26 people in one village had been sentenced to death. And I think we can all imagine what it must be like for a small village to have 26 of the people living there sentenced to death. And ultimately, I think 12 or 13 people were executed of those 26. And I had arranged an interview. And when I arrived, there must have been 20, 30, maybe 40 people waiting. And I looked at the person who was translating for me and I said, how come all these people are here? And he said, they've come to speak to you. And I said, how do they know? And he said, it was announced over the radio. And I wasn't sure whether he was joking, but I spoke to some of the people and they said, yes, it's true. And some of these people had literally walked 3, 4, 5 hours over the hills. I don't know if everybody knows the Transkei, but the Transkei has got lots of hills. So people were walking over hills to come and share their stories. And I found out that in the 20 whatever years or 30 years since all these people had been executed, not a single person, nobody from the government, no journalist, nobody had ever come to hear their story. So they had been kind of, in a way, sitting with the story. And everybody just needed to share their story. And I think it must be terrible if something like that happens to you and nobody listens. Nobody has ever heard your story. And your question, whether they will get the recognition, I fear that it will take more than one voice. I'd like to think that I'm one voice who's spoken now and said they need to get the recognition, and quite frankly, a memorial which certainly has good intentions and is not a bad memorial, but has so many mistakes, that's not giving them the recognition that it deserves. And it's not even open to the public. You know, it's a museum, but you have to actually apply to the Department of Prisons to get permission. And it's a whole, you know, it's very few people would do that. So to get this recognition for these people, I think we need more than one voice. I'm one voice, but I would like to think, and if my book does anything towards helping getting more voices, calling for recognition, then I'd be a very happy person.
That was Peter Auf Der Heyde discussing his book, Death in Pretoria.